So we're still in Joshua, and we're looking at the inheritance in that Messianic era. The world is celebrating, the new year right about now. That's when the calendar turns over. And if you look around, you watch, you listen to some of what people are saying, what do you think is probably some of the most common themes or things that people are talking about when they're thinking about their new year right about now? I'm glad 2020 is over, right? Yeah, they've expressed his thanks that last year is over, and they also are saying, I sure hope that this coming year will be better, because surely it can't get any worse, right? Yeah, that's a dangerous thing to say and to count on, because yes, we all know that it can. So many are hoping for this world to get better, because really, this is the best that they think it's ever going to get. What we see and what we experience here in this day, they don't or they can't understand that the world as it is right now is ever going to be any different. They don't have the faith to understand that the way things are right now in our day, in this world, is not the way it's supposed to be at all. It was not supposed to be with this and functioning like this, acting like this. There is no real expectation that anything will ever change. And when you read about Timothy, where it talks about how some of those that are mocking about when those that talk about the coming of the Lord, they'll say that, everything is going on as it has since the beginning. Nothing's ever going to change. All our benefits, everything will work and operate in the rules and the ways that the world works right now. And if some variation is going to be, that their understanding is that this is the best that it's going to get. And if we can only think of our future and our hope in terms that the world values things, that of getting money, power, fame, if that's the best that we think that this world is going to be, then we are truly to be pitied. Because that's a really sad expectation of what the Lord is providing for us. Because that is not the hope and expectation of the Scriptures. We've been going through the book of Joshua. We've been talking about how the Israelites, as they enter in, is that they take and occupy the promised land. That's a picture, that's a glimpse, that's a type of what will happen when the Son of Man appears in power and glory and the Messianic kingdom arrives. Last week we looked at how the enemies of God unite against the coming of the King and what his response is going to be in assembling his people. That was some of the things we talked about last week. This week we'll see what happens after the battle has been won and the authority of the King is established. We are still waiting for all of that. We're still waiting for that reality. We're still waiting for that truth and that event to come to pass. We're still in this time between the spring feast, talking about and describing his first coming, and the fall feast describing Yeshua's second coming. We're in that long, sometimes hot, sometimes dry summer where the harvest continues to grow along with the anticipation of the coming harvest. That's what we are. That's the time period that we're in. We're in that harvest time. We're in that summertime between the feasts. And so this long summer, when you think about it, it's when the owners of the fields and the vineyards, they may not have as much to do in the fields, because the crop's already been planted. It's already been, everything they're going to do for the crop has been done, and it's just a waiting game for things to happen, typically at that point. So with the owners of the fields, the owners of the vineyards, they begin making their plans. They begin putting things in place and looking forward to what's coming in the fall with the harvest. They start looking around for the workers that will be able to help in bringing in the harvest. They don't necessarily walk out on the day the harvest is going to start and say, hey, I need to hire a bunch of people to do it. Now, there's some parables that talk about that, but there are some that they're hired ahead of time. And of course, there's a great celebration in bringing in the harvest. That's what the Feast of Tabernacles is all about. But even as the harvest has been brought in, there's still work that gets to be done even after the harvest has been brought in. And the responsible master, the responsible owner, will already begin thinking about what needs to happen next. He'll already even be thinking about next year and preparing the land for the future. So when the king comes and is on his throne, when he arrives and wins and achieves the victory in battle, he's already thinking about what his kingdom is going to look like. He's already thinking about who do I need, where do I need them, who can I put in place to help fulfill this vision of the kingdom that he has. And so he's going to reward his faithful with their inheritance, with their blessing, with their responsibilities in the new kingdom. And a lot of what the king assigns, when you look at how things work and operate, a lot of what the king assigns has to do with the land. And that's really no different than what it was at the very beginning when the Creator made Adam and gave him the first assignment. You look back in Genesis chapter 1. He says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the flying creatures of the sky, over the livestock, over the whole earth, and over every crawling creature that crawls on the land." In chapter 2 he says, "Then Adonai Elohim took the man and gave him rest in the Garden of Eden in order to cultivate and watch over it." So there was purpose in creating the man. He was granted the role and authority to rule. He was given responsibility. Adam was going to rule and have the authority as a representative of the Creator himself. And so when we come to this moment where he gives him rest in the Garden of Eden, as part of that role of ruling and representing the Creator, Adam's job is to cultivate and watch over or guard or protect the garden. He was essentially responsible for the land, its care, its management. He was to guard and protect it, prevent an enemy from entering and occupying. Now, Adam didn't necessarily do the best of jobs on all of that, did he? An enemy came in. But even when Adam was given rest in the garden, we lost somebody. Even when Adam was given rest in the garden, he still had work and responsibility. That's not how we picture rest, is it? When we think of rest and taking a day off, we usually think of not having work to do. But rest in the garden came with your cultivating and watching over it. It was not supposed to be a burden to do the job that God has for his people. It was not supposed to be hardship for him to fulfill that purpose. See, Adam still had work and responsibility, so we were not created to do nothing. We were not created with the purpose, or we were created with a purpose, for a purpose, with a purpose to accomplish. Right, and it's no different here. When we're looking at this moment here in Genesis, how we are assigned this land, assigned this portion within the garden to guard and cultivate. Joshua had similar moments in taking the land. And again, it was foreshadowing the life in the coming Messianic era. So when we looked at in the past, weeks. He says, Joshua captured the whole country according to all that Adonai had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. And then the land had rest from war. Right? So the land had that rest. The major battle was over. Control of the territory was theirs. But that did not mean that it was the time for them to take it easy. That didn't mean that everything was over and done, that there was nothing left to do. There was still very much plenty for Israel to do in this time that they have taken over the land, even in this time when there is rest from war. It's not like the image that many people have when they think of heaven, or when they think of eternity, whatever their mindset or picture is of the afterlife, that everyone is sitting around on a fluffy cloud, right, playing a harp and all those other kind of silly nonsense, right? As if we have nothing to do is the idea of the total life of leisure. How many of y'all go a little crazy after a day or two of doing nothing? I go crazy after a day or two of doing nothing. I can't even make it a day most of the time. So even in the promise, even in the Messianic era, there will still be things for the people of God to do. The inheritance has to be distributed, and the job of the representative rule has to begin. Joshua, again, he's a picture, he's a type of the Messiah. He's distributing the inheritance in the land among the tribes of Israel, and the dividing of the land and the inheritance is important. It's even something that is talked about in that coming future, in that Messianic era. Ezekiel talked about it in Ezekiel chapter 47. This is that time of the coming of the Son of Man. He says, you are to divide this land for yourselves to the tribes of Israel. See, again, this pattern is repeated. So you are divided by lot for an inheritance for you and for the outsiders who dwell among you, whoever bears children among you. So again, this is even expanding. There is going to be some kind of inheritance. There is going to be some kind of receiving of the land of some kind, even for the outsiders, even for those that don't have an assigned tribe in that sense. He goes on and says, they will be to you like the native born of Bnei Israel, and they will be allotted an inheritance along with you among the tribes of Israel. And in whatever tribe the outsider lives, there you will give him his inheritance. It is a declaration of Adonai. So what happens here in Joshua gives us insight into what kind of things we can expect at the second coming. This distribution of the inheritance and of blessing. For the Israelites, for the believing community, the land, their inheritance given to these tribes was not empty of responsibility. It was not empty of responsibility in all these things. It goes on in Joshua chapter 13. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years when Adonai said to him, you are old and getting on in years, yet very much of the land is still left to possess. This is the land still left, all the regions of the Philistines and all the Gershonites. So he goes on this long list of these groups that are still there, of this land that still has to be fully controlled. Again, the major battle is over. Joshua, the Israelites control the land, they control the territory. But there are still things left to do. And even in the Messianic era, after the defeat of the armies of the world, after the defeat of the Antichrist, there will still be land to possess. That land will still have inhabitants. Those who were not a part of the military, those who did not come as part of the army to fight against the Lord. There will still be towns, villages, communities that might not have had a strategic battle importance, but where people still lived nonetheless. And not all of these are going to be happy with the fact that their side lost. All right, there's still going to be enemies. And as Caleb knew this, when he was receiving his inheritance, when he was talking about the hill country, he was looking forward. He was talking about his inheritance. He says, I am still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so is my strength now for war and for going out and coming in. Now therefore give me this hill country, about which Adonai spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there, as well as great and fortified cities. He says, perhaps Adonai will be with me, and I will drive them out, just as Adonai has spoken. And so Joshua blessed him, and he assigned Hebron to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, as his portion. So Caleb, he knew that in receiving his inheritance, that there were still some battles that were going to be ahead, still some challenges that were going to be ahead. He still had some fighting to do. He still needed courage. He knew that it was going to be a fight. But he also trusted in the Lord to do what he has promised. He knew that the Lord was going to continue the process of establishing his rule and his reign in the lives of all the peoples. Back in chapter 13 he says, I myself will drive them out from before Bnei Israel, only allotted to Israel for an inheritance as I have commanded you. And so again, this is a picture of what we can expect to be seeing happening in some way, some form at the second coming, in the Messianic era. We can be assured that Adonai is going to be with us. Right? That's never to be in doubt. That's never to be in question. Victory will not be an uncertainty. Victory has already been established. His rule and his reign is there. It just needs to spread out and to fill the whole earth. There will be people who are not particularly on board with the new sheriff in town. There will be people who won't know the new way of life of the kingdom and will need to be taught, need to be educated on that. Torah, the instructions of the Lord will need to go forth from Zion. That's one of our favorite passages from Isaiah chapter 2. We use it, we talk about it, we quote it often, and it may seem obvious, but it needs to go forth. That means the rule and the authority of the Torah needs to be established by those who are representing the king. Right? It says, it will come to pass in the last days, again, so this is future, that the mountain of Adonai's house will stand firm as the head of the mountains and will be exalted above the hills. And so all the nations will flow to it. It says, then many peoples will go and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of Adonai, to the house of the God of Jacob. Then he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For Torah will go forth from Zion, and the word of Adonai from Jerusalem. And so this is some of the tricky parts for us to understand. Believers, at the coming of the Lord, we're supposed to be transformed, aren't we? Changed. We will already have been transformed and glorified at his return. We'll have the Torah written where? Here, on our hearts, as Jeremiah 31 says. So we won't need to be taught his ways at this point. But those who remain will need to be taught this new way of life based upon his Torah. They'll need to be shown how to walk these paths. That will be part of our responsibilities as the servants of Messiah, extending possession of the land for the Messiah, because his kingdom is going to be over all the earth. So these that remain live in these towns, these villages, these cities, these communities. They'll need governing by representatives of the king. Just like Caleb, when he received his inheritance, he was given Hebron. Hebron was not an empty place. There were people, communities, cities that will be under, that he was going to be in charge of, that we are going to be in charge of as representatives of the king, which again is consistent with the parable of the talents that Luke tells in chapter 19. The way that the master rewards his faithful servants, those who have proven themselves faithful even in the smaller matters. Luke is the only one that puts it like this. This is the parable of the talents. He says, as they were listening to this, Yeshua went on to tell a parable because he was near Jerusalem, and they supposed that the kingdom of God was about to appear at once. So we know that Yeshua is using this parable primarily to teach his disciples that there's going to be a waiting period. That the inauguration of this Messianic era is not going to be immediate because the harvest needs that long summer to grow. So he is teaching them how they should live in the meantime, faithfully doing what he expects of them, obeying his commands, being fruitful with whatever they have been given for his glory. But it also reveals what will happen afterwards when the kingdom actually does arrive and the master is on the throne of authority. Verse 16 says, now the first of the servants, the first of the slaves appeared, saying, Master, your 1 mina has made 10. And the master said to him, well done, good slave, because you were faithful with so little, take charge over what? 10 cities. Also the second slave came saying, your mina, master, made 5. Then he also said to this one, you are likewise over 5 cities. This is the Messiah distributing the inheritance in the land to his faithful. Take charge of, have authority, jurisdiction, mastery over these cities, their populations. And what are they going to be doing as they are governing in those places? As they are having jurisdiction in those places, they are teaching them the Torah. They're showing them how they are to walk in the ways of the Lord, even how to worship. Ezekiel 44 talks about some of the Lord's servants and those serving the Cohens and the priests in those days. He says, they will teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, and explain to them the difference between the unclean and the... That's the good thing about how we're trying to live now. We're trying to come to understand those things today because we know that's how we're going to live in the future. Right? And we should try to live by the rules of the kingdom as much as we are able, not waiting for someday in the future, but for now. Right? They will teach them the difference between the unclean and the clean. He says, in a lawsuit, when there's disputes, when there's arguments, when there's disagreements, they will stand to judge and judge in accordance with my ordinances. They will keep my laws and my statutes in all my moedim and keep my Shabbatot holy. So even in part of this, even in those future kingdoms, as part of the ruling and having jurisdiction over, it's also going to include what? The feast days and the Sabbaths. You see that? This will be over the whole world because everything is his. He will reign over all the earth. And with those cities comes, and when you have like Caleb given control of Hebron and such, with those cities comes the surrounding territories, right? It's usually not just the city and city limits. It's everything around it as well. That includes things like the fields that are around, because the food, everything was local, right? Well, almost everything was local. It's fields that require cultivating, plowing, removing the rocks, building the walls, planting, harvesting. It includes like the groves of trees and things like that. Pines like in Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon for lumber, olive trees, other types of orchards for fruit. Right? There might be rivers in that territory that is under jurisdiction of the cities. Maybe these could be diverted for irrigation. There might be lakes and springs, lakes for fishing. And when you read on in Ezekiel, what happens to even the Dead Sea when the waters that come out of Jerusalem come and touch and fill the Dead Sea? What happens to it? Y'all remember? Doesn't the salt water becomes fresh? And it's not just fresh and empty, because right now it's largely empty. But the Dead Sea becomes fresh water, and it becomes teeming with fish. All right? So there are lakes and springs, things that need to be managed. There may be wells that need to be dug. There may be minerals and things in the ground, mines and things that to be managed. The whole earth will be under the authority of the king. And the great thing about it is the resources of all the earth are going to be brought to him and for his glory. Its abundance will finally be realized. So many times we look at the world and so many are arguing about what do we do with the finite, the limited resources that the earth has these days. And those are some good questions to be asking. Because right now, the resources of the earth are finite and limited. But in that future, its abundance will be fully realized. That's something that we've lost. Ever since Adam's fall in the garden, the earth has been subject to frustration. This is Genesis chapter 3. Then to the man he said, because you listened to your wife's voice and ate of the tree which I commanded you, saying, you must not eat of it, cursed is the ground because of you, and with pain will you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles will sprout for you. You will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow will you eat food until you return to the ground. Okay, there's some important things to notice in all of this. When the man, the gardener, the representative of the Creator, worked the ground, it was not supposed to produce thorns and thistles. You see that? Before the fall, he was working and cultivating the ground, cultivating the garden, and that was not happening. All right, it was not supposed to be a painful experience for him to grow food to eat. It was not going to be by the sweat of his brow. This was not supposed to be a hardship. But now, because of the fall, because of sin, it has become all of that. That is what has changed. Can you imagine, farming? Those of you who have gardens and try to grow things, can you imagine farming with no need for plowing or breaking the soil? That would be awesome. Can you imagine farming with no weeds or weed killers? Not having to worry about it. Can you imagine farming with no fear of bugs destroying the crops? Can you imagine there's no need for pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, there's no molds, there's no blights, no diseases, no need for genetic modification, no GMO stuff, right? Just sow the seed and it produces. Automatically, every time. And, when Yeshua talks about sowing the seeds, he talks about a harvest that is how much more times what is sown? 60, even 100 times what is sown. In the garden, do you think it was anything less than 100 times what was sown? So imagine you want to feed something and you say, man, I have a limited amount of space. I can cultivate, a square yard of soil and sprinkle some seed on it, and I'm going to have 100 times what I just put into it. Is there going to be a food shortage in the kingdom of God? No. There's not going to be a food shortage because you just walk around and drops a few things and bam, there it is. All right? Just sow the seed and it produces fruit automatically every time. The abundance of the land under the rule of the Messiah is going to be maximized to its fullest extent, because right now we're not seeing that. As much as we are able to grow and accomplish and do, we're not seeing the world to its fullest extent. And even creation itself wants to get back to that situation. Creation itself hates the fact that it is subject to frustration, and creation is waiting for the reign of the true king and his representatives, his gardeners, and so it can return to doing what it was made for. Paul speaks of that in Romans chapter 8. And he says, I consider the sufferings of this present time, this is what we're at, not worthy to be compared with the coming glory to be revealed to us. It's like we see it now. We know. Do we know the world is broken? We do, right? We were just singing about that. We do. So we see things now, and what we see now is nothing by comparison to what is going to be revealed. He says, for the creation eagerly awaits the revelation of the sons of God. That's talking about the redeemed. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free. Because it was put in bondage by those who fell. The sons of God who fell and who sinned. And it's through our redemption that it is restored to its purpose. That the creation itself also will be set free from bondage to decay into the glorious freedom of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans together and suffers birth pains until now. Creation being set free, the earth being set free for all of its abundance, is glorious freedom. Freedom from all of the restrictions placed on it due to Adam's sin, to a time when it no longer produces thorns and thistles, but supplies all of our needs without toil or pain. There's those passages where it talks about the trees of the field will do what? Clap their hands. Even the stones itself will do what? Will cry out, right? There's rejoicing even among these things in creation because they're able to accomplish their purpose. Revelation even gives a glimpse of this fully utilized abundance in chapter 22 and what the world will one day get back to. So it says, Then the angel showed me a river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Again, this is a lot of the same picture that's in Ezekiel 47. It says, Down the middle of the city street, and on either side of the river was a tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit. Now that itself is a difference from the way the world is now. A tree bears one kind of fruit. He says, yielding its fruit, how often? Each month. Now wouldn't that be nice? Again, would there be a shortage of food if the trees, the orchards, and all the plants were bearing their fruit every month? There would not be a hunger problem. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. It says, no longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in the city, and his servants shall serve him. So when the Messiah comes and distributes the inheritance to his faithful servants, it comes with responsibilities. There are still things to do. That's what Joshua is telling us. Enacting his rule and his reign in the land that we are given, overseeing the blessing of the land and its abundance, because the sons of God will be revealed and creation itself will no longer be subjected to its restraints, but that's still going to need overseeing. He still assigns responsibilities to his people. It still needs governance, and that includes, as we were looking at in Ezekiel 44, keeping the feasts. Seeing that the land, seeing that the remaining nations keep the feast of the Lord, because there are consequences for not doing so that will prevent the land from producing in its abundance. Y'all remember that? The Zechariah passage that we like to look at about how, look, even the Feast of Tabernacles will be celebrated and kept in the kingdom. But he says that all the survivors from the nations that attacked Jerusalem, so they're there, will go up from year to year to worship the king, Adonai Tzavaot, and to celebrate Sukkot. Furthermore, if any of the nations on earth do not go up to Jerusalem, implying that there may be some that don't want to Jerusalem to worship the king, Adonai Tzavaot, they will have no rain. And what happens if the land has no rain? It's not going to produce in the way that it's supposed to. All right, so even the abundance of the earth is affected by our obedience. And the Father is looking to extend his rule. He's looking to extend his reign over all the earth so that all people will live with this abundance, live in perfect justice, live in ways that is pleasing to him. Even all of creation will bring forth its abundance and blessing. And of course, that's because that's all giving glory to him. That's directing everything to him and his rule and his blessing. And the Father is looking for his people. He is looking for servants that will faithfully administer his rule. The inheritance we receive, the responsibilities that come with it that will be given, that's all up to him. He decides what we are given. We just need to be faithful with what we have been given. We need to be faithful with what we've already been given. Because if we are faithful with what we've already been given, then he will give us even more in the days ahead. Be faithful with what he has given us in the days that we have, because the inheritance that we have, the inheritance that we are promised, that we are looking forward to, is great. And it's better than anything we can imagine. This is a passage that's become one of my favorites. It's 1 Peter chapter 1. It says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah. In his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Messiah Yeshua from the dead." That's our salvation. That is the only way that we are entering into his kingdom, in his favor as his servants. He has caused us to be born again to this living hope. He says, I just lost it. He says it's an inheritance, an incorruptible, undefiled, and unfading inheritance. All right? Incorruptible, undefiled, and unfading. Incorruptible means that it's not going to decay. It's not going to break down. It's not going to ruin. If you leave a precious prized possession, like some of these guys, they park their favorite car out on their lawn or whatever else, put it up on blocks or whatever else. What happens to that car eventually?
Breaks down.
It's going to break down. If you don't use it, if it just sits there in storage forever and you take great care to make sure it's in an ideal situation, but you don't use it, what happens? It's still going to break down. It's still not going to operate the way it's supposed to. So the inheritance that we have is something that is incorruptible. It's not going to break down. It's not going to die or decay. Right? And so many things that we have in life are even something living. Like crops or like animals or like herds and things like that. None of these things are going to compare, because all of those things can grow old and die. But this inheritance is incorruptible. It's also undefiled, which means is it something that can never be declared common, nothing that can ever be declared unclean, nothing that can never be acceptable to the Lord. All right? Just about anything that we have in the world today can be made unclean and unacceptable to the Lord. But this inheritance that he gives cannot. And then he says it's unfading. And this is talking about its beauty. Right? Same thing, I like to look at it in terms of jewelry or precious metals or things like that. Eventually those things get covered in dust, they get dirty, they get tarnished. All these other kind of things can happen to something that's beautiful to where it's not as beautiful as it should be. So this is something that is incorruptible, it's undefiled, it's unfading, it will never lose its beauty. It's an inheritance that has been reserved, set aside, marked out in heaven for you. He says, by trusting, you are being protected by God's power for a salvation that is ready to be revealed in this last time. That's what we are looking forward to. That's what is the promise that is to come. And so because regardless of what happens this year, regardless of what any politician or any president promises or withholds, because we have faith in Messiah Yeshua, we can always be looking forward to the inheritance from the true King. Can we not? I am less concerned about what this year may bring, and we should be more concerned about the Father is going to bring. What the Father is going to do, what he wants to do in me, for me, through me, in you, for you, through you. How can we be faithful through this year, regardless of what comes our way, regardless of what happens or what our government does? Because all of these governments, all of these leaders, even if we don't know who is going to be at this point, this whole system is going to fall. All of them are going to submit to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, because the word of the Lord, the true King, has come or will come to take his throne. That is going to happen at some point. Maybe this year, maybe next year, maybe in the next few years. Maybe it's not up to us to know or decide exactly when that's going to be. But we are to live faithfully until then, so we can receive this inheritance that he has promised. And he is going to distribute this inheritance to his faithful servants. And until that time, until that happens, our faith is going to be tested and tried. But he wants his children to be found faithful. And he wants us to keep our eyes fixed on that reality, this reality of this incorruptible, undefiled, and unfading inheritance that is reserved for us. Because you can rejoice in that. Rejoice in that reality. Rejoice in that greatly. Rejoice in that promise, that future, that reality. Because even right now, for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials. That's where we are right now. And if we focus on the distress of these various trials, we begin to lose sight of that great promise and that great inheritance. Right now, everybody's worried about what's going to happen this year. And they're more worried about the various trials going on right now. And they're taking their eyes off of what's coming. He says, these trials, what's happening, what may happen over the course of the next year, are so that the true metal of your faith, which is far more valuable than gold, which will perish though refined by fire, these trials are coming so that the true metal of your faith may come to light, may be revealed, may be brought to the surface in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Messiah Yeshua. This is a picture of that forging type of process, that taking of a metal ore and getting all of its impurities out. All these things that are going on right now are going to show our faith. and what we truly believe. His desire is that it's going to receive praise, glory, and honor upon his return. But what these trials are also going to do, these trials are also going to show whose faith is genuine and whose is not. Because leading up to his second coming, there's also that discussion of what? A great falling away. Right? A great deception of things. And so those kind of trials, those who don't have a genuine faith in Messiah Yeshua, they don't really believe in the inheritance, in the promise. Their names are not really written in the book of life. And so these trials he wants our faith to be made more and more beautiful, more and more revealed. He goes on, he says, though you have not seen him, and we have not with our own eyes, he hasn't been physically here, you love him. And even though you don't see him now, you trust him and are filled with a joy that is glorious beyond words, receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. That's the outcome. We don't have to have seen him with our own eyes to believe, to trust, to have joy, even in the midst of our trials. But we know that that promise is coming. We know that that salvation is coming. We know that the King on his throne is going to be distributing out his promise and his inheritance to his faithful servants. That's what we have to look forward to. That's the promise that we know will be fulfilled. And we must keep this future, this promise in mind more than the events that are going on around us. Than this year and anything that it brings. None of those things are going to be as important as the year of the Lord's favor that we know is coming. And so may we live for that time. May we see it in our day, and may we be found faithfully using our gifts to their fullness in the meantime. Amen.